Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that invites you into discussions taking place in your community on today's local and global issues. Now, your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, the Dean and Academic Vice President of the college, Michael Marsden.
Good evening, my name is Michael Marsden, and I'm your host for this edition of Conversations from St. Norbert College. Our topic this evening is the moral imperative of global climate change, and our special guest is Dr. Robert Gronski, Senior Policy Coordinator for the National Catholic Rural Life Conference, where he coordinates policy at the federal and state levels. These policy positions deal with farm and rural life, land stewardship, water quality, global climate change, and community food security. Dr. Gronski has extensive rural development work experience overseas, mainly in the Asia-Pacific region. He received his doctorate in rural sociology from the University of Missouri-Columbia. Dr. Gronski, welcome to our program. We're really pleased to have you on campus for a couple of days, actually. And,
That's right. Yes.
And to share your thoughts with us on this program as well. Tell us a little bit about the work that you and your colleagues do at the National Catholic Rural Life Conference.
We're a small, humble organization. There's just a few of us. And as you mentioned, the policy work, I was brought in about 10 years ago to work on the Farm Bill, the 2002 Farm Bill, and then the more recent 2008 Farm Bill. It's been a lot of our effort. My colleague, Tim Kautza, is environmental science and education, and he has a background in soil science and water resources, and has gotten very engaged in the climate change issues, so we work together on that. We have our executive director and others that work on agribusiness accountability.
What's the history of the conference itself in terms of the Catholic Church in the United States?
It got its start 85 years ago, 1923, in St. Louis, but it's a national organization to address the needs of rural parishes, rural America. Mm-hmm. Over time, though, it's tried to adjust as we've had industrialized agriculture and what that has meant. It's got into farm worker issues. It's got into trade issues. So we try to stay as current as possible in everything that affects rural America, agriculture, and the environment.
Is part of your charge to sort of make sure that the various policy issues that you work on are infused with Catholic social teaching?
Very much so, yes. We rely on, I would say, Catholic social teaching in regard to the encyclicals, particularly since Rerum Novarum. Right. In the 1890s. Ever since then, that whole question, of the social question, we try to apply that to agriculture, food issues, hunger issues, and now very much environmental issues. We also work very closely with the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, and we're working closely with them now on climate change.
Interesting. I've read now your statement in a web-related publication that you feel we have a moral imperative to deal with the whole issue of global climate change, and I used it as part of my introduction, but can you clarify what you mean by that and give us a couple of examples of how the moral imperative would cause us to take action?
Sure. Before we get to climate change, I mean, we already have a moral imperative to take care of the most vulnerable, the least among us, the poor and the hungry. And when we have environmental impacts that cause droughts or starvation in certain parts, the church is very good at responding at that. And I don't think anyone would deny that we need to act as a people around the world here. And if there's problems in Africa, problems in Asia, we as a nation as well will respond to that. And the church is always very good, I think, at showing up when there's flooding that has taken place here in the Midwest, the recent summer. Katrina, a lot of people went down to
still going down, actually.
So that's moral imperative there in environmental catastrophes that happen like that. We can anticipate now that these will continue, these will increase, these violent weather events and the impacts of climate change. We can anticipate this. So we believe that there is this moral imperative to begin to, on the one hand, mitigate that, try to fix that, and on the other hand, begin to adapt to it. And as a church, what can we do beyond what the government does and what business and corporations will do?
So you think the Catholics have a very special obligation because of their belief system?
Very much so.
To act.
Yeah, and it's. I think they've always had the right statements over the many years here, but I think the focus has become more now, let's do some action. Let's cause some social change, and let's make sure that not just the statements, but the people in the pew begin to act on these initiatives. And I have to say that the mainline Protestant churches particularly have been pretty good about that initially. And we make our statements as Catholics, but now we have got to kind of catch up, I think, with the rest of the faith community.
Back it with the actions.
Yes, exactly.
Now, I know you're probably as surprised about this as I am, but having certainly watched former Vice President Al Gore give his presentation about global climate issues, particularly in the film An Inconvenient Truth, and many other, of course, publications that deal with these issues and the things we read, the things we see, yet there are still people who don't believe there is a global climate problem. Why is that? How is that?
Well, when we first got involved in this, that was always our effort up front when we would talk to groups, is dealing with that particular question of convincing them that the science is saying this, and now we've got to move forward. But there was always people holding back a little bit. So why wouldn't science just answer that question right off the bat, and why can't we move ahead here? Well, I dare say it became a political conversation.
It did,
beyond
indeed, yeah.
a science conversation. And maybe some of the science was still dealing with some uncertainties, or how to really address the issue once we consider.
Or maybe the scope of it more than anything else.
Yes, the scope and when the impacts would start to happen, and how severe, what would adjust or not adjust. Well, it got into the political realm. And I'm not sure if we should go here or not, but I would have to say that it became partisan, that it did seem like on the one hand, the Republican side had their position that this is going to involve a cost. Are we the ones that have to bear that cost? And where the Democrats say we have to do something quite urgently here. Although a more interesting factor when I was looking at some of these, and this was backed up by the Pew Center on Climate Change, which does these surveys, the more educated you were. So if you were a college-educated Republican, you would be very not convinced about the science. If you were a college-educated Democrat, you would be, we've got a great urgency here, we've got to start changing. Where the rest of us were kind of just in between trying to hear what we need to do as a nation and as a people. I feel a bit more encouraged now that we've come to the point where both parties are beginning to act a little bit more in concert. We do have to do something about climate change. Right. And we'll see how it proceeds now in this, I would say, almost a new era, or a new generation of politics.
Well, there's also new leadership at the very top that has put this as a major agenda of the administration.
The promise is there. So, the hope is there. We'll have to see how it now plays out. Right. All the good words are being said, but now we're going to come down to the reality.
Right.
And the Catholic Church will very much keep that conversation going, I believe, on Capitol Hill and within state governments.
Let's talk a little bit about the challenge of the global climate change and Catholic social teaching, particularly how that relates to two issues. One is the common good and the other value of prudence. So how does all that interact, and what does that lead us to do?
The word prudence actually was part of, in 2001, the Catholic bishops came out with a statement about climate change, and they put in their prudence. We have options before us. And how do we be prudent in choosing those options of dealing with climate change, but also how will that affect the economy? And that gets back to maybe our partisan politics to some extent. But we have to be prudent here. We want to make sure that we're not increasing the further impacts of climate change eventually over time. So we have to do something. But do we want to bear more cost to our economy, which, as we know, is suffering,
fragile.
Is very fragile. Yes. So how are we going to deal with that? So prudence is trying to sort through those options. The common good, I think the Church brings a particular voice to that principle, to that ethic. We don't want to just be concerned with our own self-interest, whether it's as an individual, as a community, or even as a nation. The common good is who is really going to bear the serious impacts of climate change, and how do we share that burden? How do we move forward together? And if someone is going to benefit a little bit, how can that part of that benefit be given over to the poor and the vulnerable?
And to make sure that it's distributed equally.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, that would be excellent. I was reading on one of your websites that 90 Catholic bishops from 38 different countries got together to issue a call for what I'm reading the phrase climate justice, and asking world leaders to really take that into consideration and so on. Now, how would you define climate justice? Because that's an intriguing concept that I'm not sure I understand.
It is, and maybe there's two ways of looking at climate justice. One is the fact that the industrialized world, kind of that northern hemisphere and Australia as well, that they've certainly benefited from an industrialized economy. They've become quite wealthy in producing the goods and using energy to do that. whereas maybe that equatorial tropical region, the less developed part of the world, is still trying to catch up on wealth and benefiting from what our living standards. So how do we begin to bring that justice together of, you've benefited from the economy as it has been, but that now has to change. So can you give us some of that wealth for us to make the type of adjustments we'll need to make as climate change begins to take place here? And it looks like, the North will still maybe even benefit from a warmer climate in terms of agriculture and production. So maybe that needs to be shared with the rest of the world as well. So the wealth and benefiting from the climate change agriculturally, we need to have some type of a just way, a moral way of sharing that as we get in over the next 90 years.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never understood that. That's a helpful explanation of a phrase that really sort of mystified me. Now, a lot of religious leaders have called for us to be stewards of creation, a phrase that, again, comes up over and over again. But that has not always been the way that organized religion has viewed the world, is it?
Well, I don't know the history as well as I would like. I would think if maybe you went back 1,000 years, and I'm thinking of St. Francis of Assisi, that his relationship with the environment
was radically different.
Radically different.
Than his colleagues.
And that the willingness to give up the wealth and become like the poor, live the poor, identify with the impoverished, both in terms of the human community, but also I think creation as well. He's quite known for his relationship with wildlife and the elements, the four elements of the earth and the water, the air. We need to reclaim that tradition, I would say. But over time, as we got into the industrialized part of our last 200, 300 years, we did take on the attitude that we're going to dominate and control and master nature, the wild.
And exploit.
And exploit, yes. Well, we went overboard, and we just got into a kind of an iron path that just kept us going to exploit for our own living standard purposes here.
I think you could actually go back, though, before St. Francis, and you can talk about the fact that the church in particular, but all religions, I suspect, in general, saw nature as something to be used because, after all, it wasn't important in this world so much as the next world was really the goal. So whatever we needed to use in this world was fine as long as we got to the next world. Now that shifts with St. Francis and others who begin to look at the world as something very important and very special in and of itself, and something that we have a special obligation towards. That's a shift.
Yes.
And I think it's always, even since St. Francis, it's been a constant struggle to come up with a balance, isn't it?
Yeah, it has. And let's bring it a little bit more contemporary. And I'm thinking of the 1960s, 1970s, where we began to really see what we were doing to our riverways, our air, the air pollution, the smog. And we were getting more attention in the media and the public on taking care of those resources. And I think the church began to pay attention to that a little bit at that time, 30, 40 years ago, but still had to make a very hard argument for this environmental ethics because of what you were just mentioning. We still had that tradition of using it for our own needs, our own purposes. But we were having a problem now. We were undercutting our environment, and that would eventually begin to really affect our living styles as well. But it's taken this 30 or 40 years for that conversation, that discussion, to really turn around. But as we've seen, that we are beginning to suffer the consequences of those attitudes. So we have to have this, as Pope John Paul II has called, this ecological conversion. And he's made that over the last 10 or 15 years, I guess, is when that began. We need that ecological conversion.
We do, and I think, it doesn't take a lot of reading to go back and understand that for early Americans with this continent, that in fact we were trying to tame the wilderness, trying to drive the devils out, in a way. And you tame the wilderness by cutting all the trees down, and you farm all the land, and you leave no brush, you leave no fence row. It's a very interesting attitude.
It is. And how much of that was pushed by Christian beliefs, by a reading of the Bible? That's an interesting conversation. I have to wonder, we have our modern part of our character, our American character, which is to be aggressive, to acquire, to use technology and science.
To dominate.
To dominate, yes. But we need to bring, again, I think other part of our character as Catholics, as Christians, is to remind ourselves that the creation was meant for the benefit of all, the good of all, us on the earth right now and in generations to come. So we're dealing with that. We're trying to sort that through again.
Difficult questions. I want to ask you a little bit about what we specifically can do in terms of our own moral obligations regarding climate change. But before I do that, I want to remind our viewers that you're watching Conversations from St. Norbert College. Our special guest this evening is Dr. Robert Gronski, Senior Policy Coordinator for the National Catholic Rural Life Conference. And he and we are discussing together global climate change and the moral imperative that it imposes upon all of us. So here we are in De Pere, Wisconsin. What is it that we honestly can do day to day to have a positive impact on the global climate issue?
We had this conversation earlier today on beginning to adapt and mitigate to what's happening out there. And we can begin with individual actions of reducing, reusing, and recycling. And businesses are beginning to become more green, applying those type of new green technologies, or green economy as it might be called. And those are a good first step. Those are the things that we need to start with. But I think we still have to have a more greater transformation taking place in our attitudes. And that I'm not quite sure how we do that just yet. We can certainly continue to push our legislators, our administration, to come up with the policies that push that along. So we need to have a change in lessening our greenhouse gas emissions. There's been a lot of discussion about that. And they make we're going to go back to 1990 levels over the course of time here. Well, yes, that's right. And I say it that way because we're still contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, and recent reports indicate that what's there now is going to be with us for the next millennium, the next 1,000 years. That was a very recent study that came out of the
long-term effects are significant.
Yes. So even if we begin to reduce, we're still adding. So it's a transformation needs to take place. So what's that step? I don't know what to suggest about that just yet, other than we need to continue to think in terms of conversion. And the church has a role to play there.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree ultimately. I want to shift the gears a bit and talk a little bit about agriculture because because that's an area I know of your special interest as well. But what's the connection between social Catholic teaching and agricultural issues now in the contemporary United States?
I mentioned earlier that we would follow the encyclicals over the last 100 years, and beginning with Rerum Novarum, which was addressing really the industrial worker question.
Yes. More than anything else, yes.
As agriculture, certainly since the 1940s and 50s, became that much more industrialized, heavily industrialized, capital intensive, that we then went back to those teachings, social teachings of the church, to see what was the impact then on rural communities. We use as one of our logos and our mission statements, care of community and care of creation. So what is the impact on farmers in this country and around the world as well with our trade policies? So we wanted to understand what was happening there. So the rights and the dignity of the farmer and the farm worker became of great concern for the church. The bishops put forward a reflection on farmers and food and the environment just a few years ago, and looking at the question of how do we take care of our basic human needs. And we can not only think about those that hunger, but also about those that produce the food and bring it to our table, the fruits of the earth and the work of our human hands. So there's quite a close connection, I would say.
Yes, indeed. But these issues get complex, don't they? Let's just take, for example, the biodiesel fuels. Let's just talk about that for a minute, because if farmers are growing crops to really help with replacing fossil fuels with more biodiesel fuels, then all of a sudden that market begins to grow, and then there's less food for other people to consume as food.
Right.
And that has an impact globally, doesn't it?
It sure does. And we kind of got caught in that debate because 5 or 10 years ago we were advocating for ethanol production as a benefit to farmers that were looking what to do with their surplus corn or surplus soybeans. There was a surplus. There was still hunger in the world, but we did have this commodity surplus. So here's an economic benefit that can return to the producers, the farmers, and to the community in terms of ethanol refineries, perhaps. So we thought this was a good strategy. Well, then we came up with this world food crisis over the last 2 years here.
And the price of corn was going up.
When the price of corn jumped up, dragged up prices of other commodity food items as well, and that began to be felt very much so overseas. Now there's a question if was it done by that type of production, ethanol production, or was it commodity speculation in the market, or was it other factors that were, I think they all contributed. But it did bring us back to that question. Do we grow food for food, grow crops for food,
right,
or grow it for fuel? And we're still answering that question. And we're going to have the problem of the energy crisis still hitting us.
Yes. Oh, yes.
The food crisis will continue. And it's all happening around this climate crisis. Right. We've got everything coming together at once.
If you look at just the United States, again, we have fewer and fewer acres in food production every year.
Yes, it does dwindle down.
It's moving into a different road. Now, we're getting better at it, and we can produce more per acre, but we still have the issue of world hunger.
Yes.
And we're not producing enough food for the world, at least at a price they can afford.
That is correct. And we get into other issues when you had mentioned moral imperative earlier,
right,
in terms of climate change, and the food crisis would be added there as well. And industry will say, well, it's a moral imperative that we use genetically engineered crops and seeds that can be drought resistant or provide a surplus. And there's questions around that as well.
Oh, huge question.
Here in the States, but also very much overseas. That has been my experiences. People in Africa and Asia, feeling that they'll be under the control of the large agribusiness corporations that control those seeds, control the inputs, control the markets. So we have that question happening as well. Mm-hmm. And climate change pushing all that.
Very complex, isn't it?
Yes, very much so.
Is it of great concern to you the way in which contemporary agriculture is organized in this country? So we end up with these mega agribusinesses that really dominate the market, in many, many ways. How do you deal with that as an issue in your own work?
In our own work, Catholic Rural Life, we've been part of an initiative called the Agribusiness Accountability Initiative, maybe somewhat of a mouthful, working with the Center of Concern, which is a Jesuit group out of Washington, D.C., trying to look at why is there such surplus of food in the world and yet so much hunger. And when you look at from producer to consumer, in between are these large agribusiness corporations. And farmers well know that they don't sell to the consumer directly. They have to go into these, these merchants. And they just continue to get larger, more concentrated, consolidated. They buy up the smaller operations. They're the ones that are making, I would say, the vital decisions of where the food is going to be produced, who is going to have access to that food, and ultimately who gets to eat and who doesn't get to eat. There's a question of poverty as well, who's able to pay for the food, the surplus that's out there.
Right.
So, and is agribusiness dealing with that? We don't believe that they are. They are, in fact, a business, and they're making sure there's a surplus of food, but someone else has to deal with the actual distribution of it.
Yes. So is the Catholic Church involved in purchasing surplus food and redistributing it worldwide?
They are, but it's interesting. Catholic Relief Services is certainly the key Catholic group that deals with that question. And they see that we can continue to find whatever surplus and move that to places of need around the world. And that is a type of charity that we all understand. But there's also a type of charity that brings that actual capability of food production back to the areas that are suffering from food insecurity. And we're working as best we can with Catholic Relief Services and the Catholic bishops to get that into our federal policies, find the mechanisms that be able to recreate or rebuild or redevelop, again, the food producing capabilities throughout the world.
Interesting, very, very interesting. And that is where we get into the issue of distributive justice, I guess.
Yes, that's right.
Make sure that the food supplies really are equitably distributed across the globe.
Yes, and the capability of producing. Everything has to be the higher priced genetically engineered seeds, or they have to be these very large equipment, very costly equipment. How do we begin to provide the type of technology that's more suitable and adaptable, appropriate technology for growing food in your own communities? We need to get back to that type of policy.
Interesting. Now, the family-owned and operated farm is something of American lore, and becoming less and less of a reality. Talk a little bit about the American family farm and whether you think that it is a way we should, in fact, return to, a way of life that we should return to, I guess, if possible.
It is possible, and I will say immediately that yes, we do want to have family farms that own the land and operate the farm, and that they control those resources and provide into a very much larger food system. But they are the ones that are producing our food. Now, is it a return to the way things used to be? There might be some of that happening as well, but we do have to think as a new type of agriculture where we do have the multitude of independent producers out there, but feeding into this still a global system where all the food needs are being taken care of here. So we try to find what that type of system might be that is not going back to the old days at all, but learning and understanding what worked back then, and dealing with the situation where we might have a very impressive global food system, but it's just not feeding everyone. So we advocate for the multitude of farmers to return to the land and be the ones that are in control of that.
Now talk about that when you talk about advocating. What do you actually do to make it happen?
For us, it's
in this country.
Yes, in this country, we try to participate as best we can in the what had been the World Trade Organization ministerial meetings. Now those have come to an end because they could not reach an agreement. But that was the place to set kind of the policies for government policies and also investment policies. So if we can begin to break away from the large dominating corporations that were creating that and get back to more of a civil society form of food production, local food production, that's what we need to do. And the government should be helping the civic producers and not going towards the big corporate producers. So we're fighting on that particular realm.
Interesting. What practical steps do you take, though, to create a new generation of farmers when so many have left the land, gone to the larger urban areas? I mean, how do you get them to go back to the farm?
That's a struggle. 10 years ago when I came to Catholic Rural Life, that meeting and we're based in Des Moines, Iowa, meeting some of the farmers in Iowa, thought at that time, 10 years ago, that within 5 years we're going to lose the family farm. They were very, very concerned. Since that, and that's still happening then, but at about the 5-year mark, things began to change a little bit, and I don't know exactly what was going on, but we did see younger farmers, beginning farmers and ranchers, get back into food production. They would do it at a very small scale, but we're now starting to see more opportunities happening in that regard. And I had to say some of the limited success of the 2008 Farm Bill was to help beginning farmers and ranchers. There are specific programs out there.
Such as what? Give me an example.
Well, that is the name of it, Beginning Farmer and Rancher. It's helping them buy the land that they would need and are providing some type of a measure to help the farm that's selling to get just compensation.
Okay.
It's providing, if they're doing conservation efforts, to give them an extra help, extra push to do conservation methods. If they're going to produce for local communities, that they have benefit that feeds into this, to schools or to hospitals or to state government institutions. There's different mechanisms along that way. Very small and needs much more funding into those grant programs. But that's the step. So as we build these models of action, we can see what works, what doesn't work, and just keep improving until, in fact, we have a new system in place over a generation.
And you're very hopeful.
We can only be hopeful. As Catholics and as Christians, that's what we stand on. That we look for those opportunities to act. We try it. If we fail, we look for new opportunities, and we keep hoping for that new future.
Well, that's at least a hopeful scenario for the future. So thank you for that. I'd like to thank our special guest, Dr. Robert Gronski, for sharing his expertise with us this evening. Please join us for future programs as we continue our exploration of the world of ideas. Until then, I'm Michael Marsden for Conversations from St. Norbert College.